The Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Actually, I've got to say the health system has improved outstandingly.
Order. We'll just have the question. Thanks, Mr. Hyde.
To the Minister for Climate Change Issues, why did he reject Treasury advice that an appropriate 2020 target for New Zealand's emissions would be 15% above 1990 levels, rather than the 10% to 20% below 1990 levels that he announced last week?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, firstly, I do not consider a target of 15% above 1990 levels would have been internationally credible. The range amongst the targets tabled in negotiations by developed countries is -30% from Norway through to 0% by the United States. Positive 15% would be untenable. Secondly, it would have been inconsistent with our election mandate, where on climate change we campaigned on New Zealand not being a laggard nor being a world leader, but doing our fair share. Our 10 to 20% target is consistent with this. Thirdly, Treasury's proposal was to exempt from the target forestry. It is the government's view that if we can get the parameters of policy correct, we can get significant plantation forests planted and make a significant contribution towards New Zealand making the -10 to 20 target.
The Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister, does he agree with Treasury analysis that in choosing a 2020 emissions target, he is opposing higher costs on New Zealand compared to that of our trading partners, and indeed, as Treasury show, cause 3 times the damage to New Zealand growth, jobs and incomes compared to Australia's target, and 10 times the damage of the target of the US?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
The economic analysis that was provided noted that the cost to the New Zealand economy of our 10 to 20% target would be very similar to the cost of the Australian target of theirs from 15% to 25%. In fact, the reason that I recommended a target range very similar to Australia's in economic cost terms is that I think it's fair, with the degree of integration between the New Zealand and Australian economies, that we take a similar burden on this important issue.
Moana Mackey.
Supplementary to the Minister, has he seen comments from the Chairman of the IPCC that New Zealand's high conditional emissions target is, quote, disappointing and inadequate? And why does the government continue to discourage the development of low-carbon sectors in the New Zealand economy by viewing climate change policy as a trade-off between the environment and the economy, a position the head of the IPCC has labelled as, quote, a fallacy?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Well, with due respect, I disagree. And that is that... Well, let me just put it in context. Do I think it's possible to reduce emissions significantly without cost? And the frank answer is I do not.
Jeanette Fitzsimons.
Does he still endorse the statement by his colleague Tim Grosser that the response to our climate change targets at Bonn was, quote, uniformly positive? And if so, how does he square that with the comments of Dr Pachauri, Chief Scientist of the IPCC, that New Zealand's goals are, quote, disappointing and inadequate, and that, quote, we clearly need a much greater level of ambition?
The Honourable Dr
Nick Speaker, I totally support, and it's been consistent with the communications I have had with a range of countries about the target that New Zealand has set. And I simply say to members opposite, both the Greens and Labour, that they were in charge of this country. New Zealand's emissions grew by 14%. We could have tabled a much more ambitious target if, in fact, the previous government had actually made some policy on climate change, rather than talking big and doing absolutely nothing.
Hekia Parata.
Tēnā koe te mana whakawā. To the Minister, what trend has there been in New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions in recent years, and how has this impacted on New Zealand's ability to set an ambitious target for a post-2012 deal?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, New Zealand can reduce its net emissions by either reducing gross emissions or planting trees. In the 1990s, New Zealand's emissions grew by 10%, but thankfully 600,000 hectares of trees were planted. During the course of the last government, gross emissions grew by 14%, and not only were no trees planted, but there was significant deforestation. It is noteworthy that if the previous government had over the same number of years constrained emissions to the same that they were in the 90s, 10%, and had planted trees at the same rate, New Zealand's emissions today would be 14% less. 14% less. So lo and behold, members opposite, that they now complain that we're not setting a more ambitious target.
Moana Mackey.
Supplementary to the Minister, has he received any indication from any of his ministerial colleagues that they will resign if they don't get their way on this issue?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
No.
Heke Parata.
Is it correct to the Minister? Is it correct that New Zealand is the only country that is including agricultural emissions?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
No. Every country has to account for their agricultural emissions on the same basis as New Zealand, both under the United Nations Framework Convention and also under the Kyoto Protocol. Countries are free to implement their own domestic policies to reduce emissions, and most, for whom agriculture is a small proportion, have not included it. This means other sectors of the economy must carry this cost. The problem for New Zealand is that agriculture contributes such a large portion of our emissions that excluding it from our domestic policy puts a higher burden on the rest of the economy.
Question number 4. Beg your pardon, the Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister. Does the Minister agree with former National Energy Minister, the Honourable Barry Brill, reported in today's Herald, commenting on this government's targets for climate change, that, quote, the cost is appalling. Why aren't we rioting in the streets? Even now we can't afford decent health care, education, prisons, so where will we find another $6 billion per year? How can a family of 4 find an extra $112 per week after tax? Or does he think that such costs are acceptable?
The Honourable Dr
Mr
Nick
Speaker,
Smith.
there's been a significant public debate about what the level of those costs. There are those that have argued it's $112 per week. I don't agree with those figures. The figures that the government believes are reasonable are those that were conducted in the study, which is about $30 a week for the average New Zealand family. That is significant, but it is my view that that is the contribution that New Zealand does need to make with respect to climate change policy.